Hello, this is Jeremiah Regan, and I have some great news. We've brought Hillsdale's incredibly popular free online courses to the Hillsdale College Podcast Network. The Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast brings you our online courses in their entirety, with courses ranging from ancient history and biblical epics to foundational political principles and the future of American citizenship. Follow the Hillsdale College Online Courses Podcast to hear new episodes every week with additional commentary and insights from our team. Go to podcast.hillsdale.edu to learn more. That's podcast.hillsdale.edu.
Welcome to the Hillsdale College K-12 Classical Education Podcast, bringing you insight into classical education and its unique emphasis on human virtue and moral character, responsible citizenship, content-rich curricula, and teacher-led classrooms. Now your host, Scott Bertram.
We continue a series of episodes from presentations delivered at Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence seminars. The Hoogland Center for Teacher Excellence, an outreach of the Hillsdale College K-12 Education Office, offers educators the opportunity to deepen their content knowledge and refine their skills in the classroom. These one-day conferences are hosted during the academic year in cities across the nation and feature presentations by Hillsdale College faculty, K-12 office staff, and leaders in the Hillsdale network of member schools. There is no cost to attend, and attendees may earn professional development credits. Currently, the Hoogland Center is hosting a series exploring the art of teaching a variety of subjects. To learn more about upcoming events, visit our website, k12.hillsdale.edu.
I want to begin talking about principles when we're thinking about teaching American history. Now, I will not always stick with principles, but here's a few I think that I probably will come back to these at some point, but I won't stick with these. I won't be just giving principles about teaching American history. I must confess, I do feel a little bit uncomfortable, awkward. I know Dr. McClay is coming to speak later, and here I am promoting his works. I did not know that until a couple days ago, and I had already made these slides. So lest you think there's some subliminal messaging going on here, that's not my intention. It just happened to be that case. But to be honest with you, I do use his text. My first principle when you're thinking about teaching American history is to tell the story. My highest recommendation to you is to avoid using particular textbooks. Instead, substitute it with a narrative text, something that's going to tell a story, tell the American story as a story. So, for example, I put two up here. The one on the left is an invitation to the American Story, Volume 1, and there's a 2, so one ends right around the time of Restoration, after Civil War. The other one, and then the other volume picks up after that. And then, so that's mostly for middle school students, kind of written for particularly middle school students at school I teach at. That's what our students taking American history use as a text. And then the other one to the right is the high school text that I use in class. It's an invitation to the American story, and it's the entirety of it all in one text. But when you're thinking about it, it doesn't have to necessarily be these particular texts, but be thinking about if you are teaching American history from a textbook, ask the question, is this a narrative? Is this telling a story to the students? That could really make a big difference. One of the other things, my next principle is telling the story for students for retention, for them to be able to assimilate the material. So your lesson, when you're teaching American history, it should take some storytelling form, because as we know, right, as educators we know, students are going to remember things more carefully, more accurately, more consistently over time, the more it's told in the form of a story. That's how we operate as human beings. And I'll kind of get into that a little bit more, I think what I mean by that a little bit later in the presentation. Dynamism is my next principle. Because of the idea of telling stories, you in fact realize that when you're teaching American history, there is a lot of movement involved. There's a lot of engagement with your students. So one principle I always try to tell teachers who are coming in, not just teaching American history or any history class, or even like literature class, I try to tell them what an old mentor teacher told me was, always drink a cup of coffee before you teach. Because there is that sort of excitement and energy you bring to the classroom, to your students, that you're gathering them, you're bringing them into a story, and you want that to come alive for them. And lastly, I may get some pushback, which is fine, but I will say it anyway, is segmenting. You're like, whoa. I'm a middle school and high school teacher. Segmenting, that's for elementary school teachers. Like, they have to be responsible for segmenting. They know how to do that. But this is where I think we can, as an as a middle school or high school teacher, take a page from their book and kind of see that when you're thinking about planning a lesson, when you're thinking about teaching your students history, segmenting, breaking your lesson up is going to pay you back in the long run. Getting sort of a different, fresh look at things throughout the lesson. We'll talk more about that in the presentation of what it looks like. But these are the sort of guiding principles that I think are going to be really helpful in terms of not only to guide this presentation, but also for you to be thinking about implementing in your own classroom. All right. What I want to position to you, or suggest, offer to you, recommend to you this morning, comes from the classical tradition. So if I was going to say, here's my argument for how you should teach students middle school and high school American history, it is through the lens of the trivium. Oh, great, here we go. Classical ed teacher coming back up here with the trivium. If I have to hear that rhetoric one more time in classical education, I don't know what, but I can't. Well, I'm gonna kind of nuance a little bit, tell you what I mean by it. But when I'm thinking about teaching, when you're thinking about teaching American history to middle school and high school students, one thing is to consider is, how does the trivium influence the way you lesson plan? Okay, so of course the trivium, grammar, this goes back from the ancient world up into the medieval world that really fine-tuned this idea of what this stage of grammar, right? That if you're going to be a student, you're going to learn, a free student, you were going to learn the basics knowledge of any subject, and then the logic or rhetoric stage they were going to develop into where, okay, now that they got the basics down, they're going to start arguing and be able to question things and formulate arguments and that sort of thing. And then finally, the highest form of the trivium himself would be the rhetoric stage, the art of persuasion. Now that you know, now that you've argued, you've discussed these ideas, how can you persuasively convince or talk about them in a way that is compelling, and articulate them in a way that's persuasive? And when we think about the trivium, okay, that's the trivium as it's throughout the time of history had a particular place. What I would like to go with you this morning is offer to you, how can you have that in your mind when thinking about preparing a particular history lesson? Okay? I hope it becomes very practical for you. What I'm going to do is I'm going to walk you through these kind of stages. I'm going to take a lesson from my own history lesson to kind of show you how this could work in your classroom, okay? Here we go. All right, so when you're thinking about the grammar of your lesson, I'm not talking about diagramming sentences, naming the predicate and the subject, right, of a history, right, sentence. No. What I'm talking about here is, what is the foundation? What is your objective of your lesson? At the end of this lesson, students will X. What? At the end of this lesson, students will know the main arguments of the progressive era, whatever it is. Everyone's operating a lesson in middle school or high school in a history lesson from the idea of what is the objective. What's your objective? What's your aim? And the grammar of your lesson is going to take about 5 to 10 minutes, maybe 5 to 7 minutes, depending upon how your class periods are. But basically what you're trying to do is a few things. You're trying to lay the groundwork. Place students' feet in the forest. Let them know where they are, okay? This could happen through review. This could happen through a recap. This could happen through showing them a sort of map of something and just asking them to tell you about it. But you want to set them up for success in your lesson. In other words, you want an unfamiliar land that you're placing them in that class period, in that lesson, to start becoming familiar. You want them to kind of understand what's going on. This happens in this first segment of your lesson, which I call the grammar. So foundational pieces, warm up. This is going to be where key ideas or dates. A lot of folks, when I say like, oh, start them in the grammar, they're like, oh, just give them dates. Yes, dates. but also there should be some more contextual things involved in this. When I'm training new teachers, especially thinking about history, and I come to telling them about this, one thing that comes to mind is you want to be in a position where you're building anticipation. All right? I tell new teachers, and I tell students this too when they're late, and they have to come to my office, and they've had so many tardies in a row. And this is my argument. It's like, the first 5 minutes of a lesson are it. You need to be there. And this is the sort of mentality. The first 5 minutes where you have them just entered into your room and they're ready to learn, that you have them is setting them up strong. And so when you're building anticipation for them, you're giving them a first taste about what they're going to see, what the lesson is going to hold for them. I kind of describe it too as another way to think of it in terms of analogies. You're priming the pump. You're getting them ready to begin what your lesson is. So, for example, this is a particular warm-up, sort of a grammar part of my lesson that I did. It's early colonial time, so it's from the fall. But right here, just the lesson before, we just finished the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War. And so this was my warm-up for them, priming the pump, where I asked them, the first question is, I gave two options here to kind of set the stage for it. But what effect did the Proclamation of 1763 have on the colonists? And there's a couple ways I could do this. I could say, turn in, talk to your partner, what's going on here. Another way I could do it is rapidly calling on students, having them write on the right whiteboard, or just simply putting on the map on the board and asking the question. And then if someone's like, Mr. Battaglia, I didn't get the notes, I wasn't here. Look at the map. What is the map showing you? What is it telling you? If you can't look at the map, talk to your partner. So again, very simple. I'm kind of laying the groundwork for them, getting them the foundational pieces of where I'm going. Okay, and you're thinking, okay, well, this just sounds like review. Yes, but then my second question kind of scaffolds it more in the sense of what is the meaning of self-government? So now I'm asking maybe a deeper tier question, or I'm asking them to start thinking in their minds, what does it mean? What does self-government mean? And by setting them up in this particular way, I'm taking intel, right? As the educator, I'm taking intel. I'm finding out directionally where I may need to shore things up just by the simple responses as I circulate my classroom and hear what's going on. If I have them write it on their whiteboard, bullet point, what you and your partner think the meaning of self-government is, I can walk around and see very clearly the direction in which this lesson could go. Get a sense for where they're going, how much of shoring up I may need to do throughout my particular lesson. This in all takes about 5 to 10, even 5 to 7 minutes, again, of just laying the groundwork, building anticipation for where we're going. When we think about a particular first segmenting of our class, we want to not only think about it in terms of painting the objective, right? So, for example, like you can probably already tell my objective is students will see or have a greater understanding of self-government and the meaning of it following this lesson, something to that effect, okay? We want to convey an idea or a theme that's going to carry us through the lesson. In other words, we just don't want to be about having facts delivered to students, particularly in the classroom, that they can't engage with. But we want to push them to be thinking about certain ideas. Part of the other last part of a warm-up or a grammar part of my lesson, or one that I'll have you consider, is kind of getting them to be thinking about questions to consider within the lesson as a whole. So, for example, you can see where I'm going with this, right? What did the Stamp Act do? Why did this act in particular undermine the principle of self-government and consent? And how did the colonists respond? Right? So I've primed the pump, right? I got them thinking, all right, self-government, we're going to talk about Proclamation of 1763, right? And now I'm going to set them more in this familiar land, kind of make more of a sort of parameters for them. All right? And so these are questions I actually have my students write down so they are aware of where this lesson is going to go, to continue to keep them on pace and to keep me on pace together as we go throughout the lesson, right? So all of these, right, I didn't just put objective, have students understand, right? At the end of this lesson, students will be able to tell or understand what the meaning of self-government is. No, I'm kind of phrasing it in the question that we can answer together. And this is building up sort of my next stage of my lesson plan, which is going to be my dialectic or rhetoric stage. And this is going to be about 15, 20 minutes. So again, I put a time frame in there because, right, we all are probably working on different schedules. Some of you may even be block schedule. I'm sorry, or I feel bad for you. So your time frames are going to look a little different than this. Some of you may be 45 or 50 minutes. I will say the first time I taught American history was block schedule, so I do sympathize with you folks. But again, this is going to be about 15 to 20 minutes. Now, okay, you have your warm-up. You've primed the pump. All right, you have the sort of questions to consider. All right, feels good about it. I see where we're going. All right, what in the world is the dialectic, logic part of your lesson? And this guy told me we need to start telling stories this whole time. So where does that part of it comes in? And this is where the sort of meat of the lesson, I would argue, comes in. This is an example I'm not going to give you like I would to sort of tell a story, but I put this in here so you could see where I would go next in my lesson, okay? A couple things that jump right off the perhaps slide to you is that my bullet points are very technical terms and they're brief. In fact, that's typically how most of my storytelling goes, is I just give what the students need to know in terms of spelling or in terms of key terms. The reason why I do that is because, well, if you give them too much, we know as educators, they're just going to copy everything down. And secondly, if they don't know how to spell Prime Minister Grenville's name, they're going to be trapped in a mental state for 5 minutes while I'm telling a story whether or not they spelled his name right, okay? And so I want to free them, liberate them from that burden, and just give them basically what they need to know in order to succeed in the lesson. So from here, how the lesson would go is I would tell the story, but tell it asking questions to students in a sort of a conversational way. I mean, you think about the best storytellers in your life. Maybe it's a father, a family member, maybe it's a friend. And one of the things that seems to be true of all of them, other than the fact that they're engaging and captures your attention, is they build anticipation and they invite you into the story. And by asking questions while telling the story, I'm inviting them into the story with me. Now, I'm not asking yes or no questions. I call those to my students fishing questions. I don't necessarily need to know, for sake, whether or not they know the date of the Sugar Act, per se. Right? I will assess them. They'll be assessed on it. But in this particular storytelling, I'm interested in more questions like, so Prime Minister Grenville, like, what? So he comes into a position, and he all of a sudden wants to begin to get money from the colonists or tax the colonists. Why is that? Why do you guys think that is? And hopefully, I'm setting students up in a way to start seeing, oh, wait. Okay, we just fought a war. Brits pay more taxes than American colonists at the time. Okay, what is he trying to do here? They're trying to feel like, right, the colonists should have their fair share of paying. So, right, I'm trying to get them to see, and then so that propels me forward to then go into my next point in terms of, okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to have a Sugar Act and kind of explain, okay, why do you think sugar would be one of those items that would be taxed? What's going on in those particular ways? What's going on with that? I'm not going to go through all these points for you, but you get the gist in the sense of like, here are the key points, and I'm going to lead my students through the story and tell it. So that in their notes, what they're taking notes on is hopefully getting the major parts that are tied to the question I'm asking throughout the story itself. One other, I keep myself on track here. One other thing that I think is a key idea when we're thinking about the logic, or what I would offer as the logic or rhetoric of the meat of the section, is to ask pointed questions that could foster a particular discussion within your class, kind of like as a break within the story. Okay, so this sounds great. All right, we have the grammar, we have laid the foundation, the pieces that we need, okay? We set them up with some questions to consider, so we're guiding them through the lesson itself, okay? Now he's telling me we got to tell stories, start storytelling to the students, that sort of thing, and kind of lead them through points. All right, so how do we know, they actually understand, actually absorbing, assimilating the material? How does that actually happen? This is great. We could tell stories to middle school students and high school students, but what is going to be that thing that really kind of gives us assurance that we actually did a job as an educator and educated them? And this is where I would propose to you something a little bit, I don't know, hokey. I don't know what's the right word, but something where I challenge my students, after we take in the dialectic sort of segmenting stage, after they have heard the lesson, told the story, giving them now an opportunity to tell the story back. Or I call it, narrate here, I love how Make It Stick uses the term, sort of this retrieval practice. And this is what I'm thinking in my mind, retrieval practice, right? It does us no good as educators if we can tell a great story, if we can convince them that this story is worth willing to hear, we've set them up to hear it, they can understand it, and then we don't ask anything of them and just leave it as that. But instead, giving them an opportunity as they have a first sort of hearing of it to tell back or to practice retrieving the story they just heard. Right? So they understand what the significance of the Stamp Act was, why it was so significant, why it would make colonists so angry, those sorts of things, right? They would get a sense. They would be able to articulate that. In my classroom, it's kind of a rapid-fire approach where they would orally present it, where I would say, okay, start with the Proclamation of 1763, go. And someone would begin. And then I would stop them and grab someone else to pull in from there particular parts of the story. Or it could just be them just writing it, documenting in their notes to a certain degree. 4, 5, 6 sentences within their notes. So that way, a couple things are happening. You all are thinking in your mind, oh, this sounds great, formative assessment. This is great, right? It's low stakes. Yes. And as an educator, I'm really quickly getting a sense for who's picking on, who's getting it, who's tracking, and perhaps who's not. Whether it's orally through the classroom calling on students, or whether it's me circulating, watching what they're writing down, that sort of thing. Now, I try to have my students retrieve without looking back at their notes. Right? This is just kind of what modern science has shown, particularly research about, kind of the idea of rereading your notes doesn't really do it as effective, and certainly rereading a text isn't as effective. And the reason why I do that is because of, obviously, that research, but also I'm thinking in my back of my mind sort of this idea of Bloom's taxonomy, right? And you can have your certain opinion about that. But at the one stage of it where students are in a position where they're being put in a position to actually show what they know. What is it that you know? Can you formulate things from our story, from the conversation itself? And so this is the sort of part of the lesson where I ask them to show what they know, have assimilation in effect within their particular point. Okay, after that, when we think about planning a lesson, we move into the sort of what I would call the sort of rhetoric, to steal the words from the trivium, the classical words, right? The rhetoric part of the lesson. Now, in the ancient world, or in the medieval world, into the medieval world, rhetoric tended to mean the stage, the moment of the trivium, where, you would get up in front of a public discourse, where you would try to convince or compel someone in a persuasive way using different mechanics, tactics, devices of your argument. When I think about or argue in terms of a rhetoric of your lesson, The question I'm thinking in my mind to my students, okay, this is great. They have assimilated this. They've learned it. They know the story. They've assimilated it. Now, what do they do with it? What's its purpose, right? So, in other words, like, okay, it's great to know the main tenets of the progressives during the progressive era, but what now can I push my students to consider what to do with it? And here, I'm not necessarily thinking like a practical, like utilitarian way, but more like, okay, how does this affect the human condition? How does this inform them as a human being, what they understand to be true about the human condition if we're studying history? Okay? So, for this particular part of the lesson, this is where I would introduce, so I just pulled this right from this particular lesson that I taught. This is where I introduced a primary source document. And some of you are like, yes, it's about time. We're history teachers. We got some good old primary source. And some of you are like, oh, dear God, I can't even think about a primary source document in my classroom right now. Yes, primary source document or something to that effect, that what I'm trying to think about in the sense of expanding their learning. Okay? Just a quick aside of primary source documents, just kind of in case you're curious. I think it's fine, in especially middle school, to consider how you can tailor that to your particular students, right? I don't think we all have some sort of love for history at varying different degrees. And I feel the conviction you have of like, there's no way I can cut on this primary source document. It would be an injustice to me as a historian or to me and my love for history. If you needed someone to tell you it's okay, that you can shave off that one paragraph or that sort of thing, I'll be that person for you. I think it's okay, especially when you're teaching middle school students and you have a very clear objective, right? If you have a very clear objective, I think it makes a lot more sense. All right, so for this particular lesson, we read An Inquiry into the Rights of the British Colonies by Richard Bland, who was a House of Burgesses member, who kind of described to the students, and this is to go back where I went to, he talks about this sort of thing of like, back in British history, they used to have like, if you were a freeholder, right? So if you were free, you owned land, that you would have representation in Parliament. And he can't quite figure out why the colonists are can't have representation. He's mentioning this word like natural law. And so that like kind of gets students engaged in terms of thinking about as human beings, right? This is where the jump is happening. How does, this idea of liberty or self-government, how does that play into the human condition? And so really challenging, building on what they know about the discussions we've had about self-government, of how this works. It's really fun in this particular one because he kind of ends it, which is fun for the students in the sense of like, basically to the fact if nothing changes, it's time to obstruct the government that's currently overseeing because of this. And so it's very fascinating. And it's kind of the sort of thing where now students are discussing ideas and they're forming opinions on them. I'm trying to, as their teacher, give them an opportunity to engage with the text, engage with ideas. I've set them up, put them in the forest, showed them familiar land. Now I want them to kind of say, okay, what can I take from this and engage in conversation? How can conversation look and engagement in it? And part of it could deal with a sort of like exit ticket of how is the principle of self-government undermined, something that could look like on their whiteboard, or kind of a turn and talk. Again, just leaving them with one last thing before they walk out of my class in this sort of rhetoric portion of it. And then this would just be maybe an assignment I would give as a sort of takeaway for homework or something like that. I had questions after the reading that would kind of shore up, again, trying to see how they would assimilate the material that was particularly given to them. I do want to give one final note about thinking about what I'm offering to you and thinking about planning a lesson with the trivium in mind. I don't think it would be wrong for me to say that, the beginning of your lesson always has to be particularly the grammar, where you're setting the sort of foundational pieces for your students. And then the next segment of your lesson should be the sort of dialectic or logic part of your lesson, where you're kind of engaging in ideas. And then finally, the sort of rhetoric portion of your lesson, where you're finally asking students the question or thinking on your own what to do with this. I think you're always, throughout a lesson, engaging in each particular stage. So, for example, like when I did this particular one, I had to give some grammar on, if I hadn't already, the House of Burgesses in Virginia very quickly, right? I had to do a little excavating for my students. I may have had to give a quick bio of Richard Bland or that sort of thing, right? So I'm kind of presenting them with the grammar I'm laying the foundational pieces, building anticipation. In primary sources, we as educators know it's going to be good that we're going to have to look at the text and find out words that we know are going to be historically difficult for students to capture the historical meaning of it, or may just be difficult in understanding the meaning of it. And so we're kind of doing a grammar in the sense as we're setting them up to be able to read a particular text really well, particularly a primary source in this case. So I just want to make it clear that when you're thinking about segmenting a lesson, like I've offered to you, you don't always necessarily have to be tight. Oh my goodness, like I'm in the last stage, end of my lesson, I should be in the rhetoric page. I can't even imagine a world in which I'd go back to the grammar, start laying foundational pieces. No, I don't mean it in that. I think that it could be more fluid, organic in the way that you're presenting it to your students. Okay. I did, lest I just told you or offered to you an opportunity to think about a lesson, I did want to offer a little bit about how I challenge or train my students to think about taking notes. Because I think we would, as educators, be in a position that thinking how great it would be if students had the right notes, the way in which they did their notes, and this was kind of across the board uniform that would help us out as we're teaching so we could get a really good sense about how our students are doing and understanding. And for this, I want to present it to you. I came up with a hokey name for it. You can call it whatever you want. Quen, that's what I tell my students when I teach them this the first day of school. Here's how I want you to take notes. Come up with your own thing. But I think the principles or the sort of the ingredients are good. So that is, you want students in their notes, and you can see where I'm going with this, or where I had gone with this, is you want them to be thinking about a question. What is it that you are going to tackle in this particular lesson? And obviously, your question is based on your objective. What is your objective? What is that going to look like? Okay? So having a good question for them to investigate as you begin your lesson, let that question really drive your lesson, right? And then the next piece of it is the evidence. Okay? So they're thinking, as they're listening to you tell the story, or you're reading it from a text. Okay, so if you're using a text in your class, that's fine. If you want to be the storyteller, great. If you want the text to be the storyteller, great. I don't necessarily, I think there should be a mix, but anyway, with hearing the story, what is the evidence that answers that particular question, right? We always in education, we have the experience, right, where a student will write down literally everything you say. And you're thinking, no, and they don't catch anything you need them to hear, right? Or they'll see what's on the board and they'll go boom and not look up again, and we've lost their attention. And that's hard, right? That's hard for us because once we've lost our attention in that sort of amount of time, it's going to be very difficult to get it back. So what I tell my students is think about what is the material, what are the details of the story that are going to answer that question. Write that down. Get a sense for that. And then finally, this last piece, this retrieval practice. All right, you have the question, you have your evidence. All right, tell me about it. Explain it to me. This is great that you have it, but it's the sort of thing of like, the parent that asks their child what you learned at school today. And the child goes, I don't know. I tell my students, when your parents ask you this question about American history, you're going to tell them what you wrote as your narration because you did it, you practiced it, you know it. Okay, and so we're training students to have one more opportunity to retrieve the material, the knowledge, and hopefully by that making it stick more is what we're after. And so they just sort of thing. I put this up here just so that you can see it. It looks a lot like Cornell. If you use Cornell node system, I really like that idea. I just stole it and transitioned it a little bit to what made sense for me. This is actually a homework assignment. But their notes in their notebook look a lot like this. So I have where they would have key vocabulary. So key vocabulary or core text or cues or things like that, that's what I would put on a slide most likely. And then I have where they're putting the question to consider, the thing that they're asking, or we're asking as a class, and then they have this space to kind of hit it, and then at the end, just telling or retrieving it back in a particular way. This is for I try to guide them with this, make it consistent throughout. This is for like even reading, if they're reading Land of Hope or something like that in this particular case. I want them to investigate a particular question and find evidence for it and then tell me about it at the end. I do make the part at the end retrieval. It's like if you don't fill that out and students turn it in, they don't get any points, even if they read, because I do believe in that particular aspect of it so much. So, but yeah, just a kind of idea like that.
If you enjoyed this lecture, we encourage you to visit our website, k12.hillsdale.edu, for additional information on upcoming Hoogland Center events and other free resources for educators.